I'll introduce them in a second. Just as a bit of a preamble, rates and reasons, the rates of and reasons for economic inactivity vary across the country. And the new government has various ambitions in relation to full employment, which will be primarily achieved, only achieved, I guess, if we draw more people back into the labour market. And combined authorities and local authorities historically and currently have been active in trying to address economic activity and have certain ambitions to do lots more. And I think to make progress, I think there's increasing recognition that we're going to need to tackle with issues around job creation and job quality. So we need to think about both sides of the labour market question, I suppose. How do we create the jobs in the first place? How do we improve the quality of the jobs that we've got? As well as most traditional supply side interventions like improving access to education and employment support and all the rest of it. So we have to think about all of these sorts of things in the round. And we've got three great speakers that can do this. So you've got Steve Machin. Steve is Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. He's also the Director of the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE and a renowned labour market economist. We've got Alice Martin, who's Head of Research at the Work Foundation. They've led brilliant work looking at insecurity and how that plays out across the country and how that then, how we tackle that from a policy point of view. And we've got Nick Witton-Dowd, who's Assistant Director, Education, Skills and Work at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, who have been active for very long time trying to think about how they improve the labour market, draw more people in, develop skills, and actually knit together different aspects of the public services agenda in order to bring more people into the labour market, particularly, but not exclusively, those that have health issues, but also then want to come back into the labour market. So that's our panel. I'm going to start off with a sort of big question to each of them. Maybe Steve can kick us off. So I suppose the first question we want to just explore is what's the nature of the economic inactivity problem and how does it vary across space? Steve, you're the ideal person to start us off on that. Give us the sort of big picture on those sorts of issues.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. So the inactive group of the population or the potential working population are people who are potentially part of a labour market but are not able to start a job or have chosen not to look for employment, unlike the unemployed who are looking for work but are unable to get work currently. And so the inactivity group has received quite a lot of attention recently because actually after long falls in the inactivity rate over the last 15, 20 years. It's ticked up quite a lot and risen significantly, certainly since the pandemic and during the cost of living crisis, which has exacerbated some of the issues to do there. Notwithstanding that, actually, the reasons for inactivity, or the main reason why people might be inactive, the composition has shifted quite significantly, and so actually there's been, I mean, you could be economic inactivity because you're temporarily ill, or you may have taken early retirement, or you're looking after family members, or you're studying at college or university. One of the striking aspects has been the issue of sickness and sometimes mental health, but other forms of sickness as well, becoming a much more significant group amongst the inactive. So prior to the pandemic, up to late 2010s, as I said, the inactivity rate had been coming down, the aggregate, although that masked a very big difference between men and women. So actually, the inactivity rate of women had fallen very significantly, whereas the inactivity rate of men actually goes up a bit. But contributing to an aggregate fall in inactivity, which seemed to be resolving itself. It displayed a cyclical nature. But now we have this very significant upturn. So about almost 10 million people out of the 16 to 64-year-old age group are economically inactive, according to ONS statistics now. That's just over 20% of all 16 to 64-year-olds. So this is a big, significant deal. And as I say, it's ticked up, which has been an important component as well, which has offset that long run decline. What's more, there's very big area-specific spatial variations in both inactivity and indeed in unemployment as well, and indeed in employment, because there are three forms of potential labour market states that we could have. So, I mean, some work I did with Jonathan Wadsworth, we argued that even now it would seem that targeting those populations in places that have been doing very badly in terms of inactivity would be an appropriate kind of policy angle to take. So maybe we can come back and talk about that. Of course, there's real difficulty about what jobs are in some of those places, because both of those things coexist. But the spatial dimension is very important, and I think the spatial composition has changed to some extent as well over time, where the inactivity rises have been quite high. I mean, the West Midlands has actually got a very, very high inactivity rates right now. I think Sandwell is the highest inactivity rate amongst local authorities currently. The North East as well. So there's clear pockets of places that have very different. Northern Ireland, there's places that have got very high inactivity rates as compared to other places that haven't got such high inactivity rates. So it seems the spatial dimension, which is what this webinar is about, is extremely important. So in terms of motivation, that's what's been going on, I think, and that's what generates the discussion, especially given the change of government and given the missions that have been put forward from various different government departments, which do bear some relevance to tackling the inactivity question, which I think is high on the agenda.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll come on to that, and particularly, I think, as you said, how the spatial dimension and the variation, not only in terms of scale, but actually the nature of it, then might influence how we think about both national policy, but also then the local activity or local policy as well. So we'll definitely come back to that. Let's go to Alice. Alice, you've been doing quite a lot of work at the Work Foundation on, the experience of work, I suppose, if we call it that, looking at the terms and conditions attached to that. But you've also done some great work looking at how then that varies across, particularly the combined authorities, which you did last year. So just the nature of the challenge, and then how that varies across space. Give us your perspective.
Yeah, so I think we approach this broadly from two perspectives. So I think the first one is looking at the relationship between industrial decline and the rise of insecure, low-paid work in the places that have experienced that. So we find that there are now 6.8 million people in severely insecure work across the UK. So that means they don't receive a regular income, they have sort of variable hours and pay, and/or they don't have access to basic employment rights. So these are the people who are, living in kind of considerable insecurity. And we found that those jobs exist in high numbers in post-industrial areas. And we also observe higher levels of both unemployment and economic inactivity in those areas as well. So a piece of work we conducted last year on levelling up found a correlation between severely insecure work and inactivity and unemployment. So we think that points to some of the kind of spatial differences that we're going to be talking about today, and also the need for kind of wraparound care and attention to those areas. And I know we'll be coming on to the kind of solutions a bit later on. But the second angle that we approach this from is with regards to workforce health. So as we've just heard, part of the uptick in economic inactivity since the pandemic has been in relation to increased reports of long-term ill health among the working population. This has, interesting kind of demographic breakdowns as well. So whilst we have seen increased participation of women in the labour force over a number of decades, we are actually now seeing that long-term ill health is a key driver of economic inactivity among women. It's actually overtaken as the main driver of economic inactivity among women, so overtaken sort of care of the home and care of the family, which historically was the main reason. So we think that's quite significant. And we're exploring this from a number of different perspectives. We're thinking about the kind of broad changes that are happening to the working age population in terms of their health, their life expectancy. So life expectancy is something that has actually stalled in its growth for a number of years now in the UK, which is concerning, and it hasn't recovered, or the growth in life expectancy hasn't recovered since the pandemic, which is really significant. But we're also very interested in the role that kind of work and kind of job design and employment practices play in actually contributing to health. And we think insecure work is a big factor there. So one of our recent studies found that insecure work for a lot of people is actually quite a long-term experience. So this idea that you might get into a sort of insecure job, and that would be a stepping stone into something more secure or kind of better career in the future. That was the understanding or the kind of line of the previous government. Our research suggests that for a lot of people, that isn't the case. A lot of people remain in insecure work for 4 or more years. So we studied a cohort of 10,000 workers using the Understanding Society survey recently, and found that 4 in 10 insecure workers were actually in those jobs for 4 years or more. And we think that could be contributing to part of this sort of health issue, and the fact that some people are actually leaving the labour market altogether because work just isn't sustainable for them.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. Again, picking up on what Steve was saying, I'd be interested to unpick that a bit more in terms of the availability of work and the nature of the work that is available. Is that in and of itself a variable that helps us understand the inactivity alongside things like health or age or gender or ethnicity, etc. So we'll definitely come back to you on that. Nick, so I think your camera may or may not be working, but you are definitely on the call. Is that right, Nick?
I am definitely here, and I'm
good.
waiting.
You do exist.
You're
not just a black void on my screen. So it would be lovely to see you, obviously, but hearing you is ultimately more important. So let's turn to you. So you probably heard what Steve said and what Alice has said. And the way I introduced you, I think, as you were coming on, was in terms of Greater Manchester, there's a long history of active engagement to try and help people at the margins of the labour market, either currently in it or not in it, to come back into it, and also to recognise that there's an integration of different types of services that is required, not just sort of classic labour market services, but also health services and home services and housing services as well. So just give us if you can, Alice and Steve have given us a big picture, all of UK perspective. Just talk a little bit about, the geography and the nature of economic inactivity that you experiencing in Greater Manchester.
Yeah, sure. And so Greater Manchester, it's made up of 10 boroughs. We have a population of 2.8 million people. It's predominantly urban, but we have rural areas around the periphery, and we have really diverse communities at a really quite local geographic level. So we see variations between those 10 boroughs. We talk about the north-south divide of Greater Manchester, not just of the country. We have significant numbers of, proportions of economic inactivity. Our economic inactivity rate is sadly going up at the moment, and it's sitting at about 25% from our latest figures. Predominantly health-related problems, but also significant numbers of people with caring responsibilities, and obviously students, retirees, early retirees, etc. But the sort of and what we see and find is it's never a single issue. There tends to be multiple issues and multiple concerns. So I think some of the most recent figures we looked at is, in totality, we have about 500,000 of our population are economically inactive in some form. But we also know that about 150,000 of those people want to work and want to be in work. And I think that's where the big challenge lies, and helping and working with them to remove some of those system barriers that can support them to get into good work. And we have a really strong emphasis on good work in Greater Manchester. It's the role of the employer in being able to do that. I think so. We have a number of programs, our Working Well programs, which you mentioned we've sort of worked on for a number of years, and increasingly have had that focus around economic inactivity, as well as how the government would define people unemployed. I don't like the artificial barrier between those definitions. People are out of work or in work. But I think we have sort of increasing programs and the need to reach out and engage with the places and the communities where those people live. And I think the other sort of big focus for us is actually on the prevention agenda and making sure people are not falling out of work, are not at risk of economic inactivity. So it's kind of turning off that flow out of work as much as supporting people into work. And I think those are sort of the key priorities in our place. From a demographic point of view, we sort of, it's at either end of the age spectrum. You know, young people, we're seeing increasing numbers, particularly due to sort of mental health challenges. In that older age group, people, we're seeing increasing numbers, often due to sort of musculoskeletal or cardiovascular type health challenges. And it's that kind of differentiation at either ends of the age spectrum that is one of the things that we're spending a lot of time thinking and talking about at the moment. Yeah. And I do apologise that you can't see me.
No.
I've tried everything.
As I said, seeing you would be wonderful, but we can hear you, and that's the most important thing. So don't worry. So let's just talk a little bit more. We'll get on to what we might do about it and how that plays out and the relevant importance, I think, of and significance and role of national and local. But Steve, you come in first, and then Alice add in. Just say a little bit more about, you know, like the inactivity problem in some places. There we go. We can see you now, Nick.
Hello.
You're more than a voice. Hello. So, you know, in some places, the inactivity problem is very large. You know, to pick somewhere like Middlesbrough, it's 3 times, the problem is kind of roughly 3 times bigger than, say, in somewhere like Reading. And it's got all the problems, as we said, in terms of, you know, some of those issues. But obviously, Middlesbrough economy is much weaker than, say, Reading's economy. So there's problems on the sort of job demand side. How do you think about that, Steve? I mean, is that material in terms of, you know, the availability of jobs, the quality of jobs? How does that interact then with people who are inactive and the reasons why they're inactive?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important. I think I can pick up on something that both Alice and Nick said in regard to that when we were going through. You know, I mean, we've got over and above the current turn up in inactivity. Of course, we've got some long run skills issues on the supply side and long run issues to do with job provision, especially in the kind of post-industrial areas as well, which Alice mentioned on the demand side. And so there's both demand side and supply side issues here to do with the employment side of things. I guess there's the additional aggregate, perhaps slight tension with current government policy on either employment, unemployment, and inactivity, about the employment target, about how, you know, an employment target of maybe 80%, which is extremely ambitious in international terms, but nonetheless is actually quite interesting. The idea about where, if you are going to try and get to that target, whether you're going to be trying to recruit people into jobs from unemployment or inactivity, is actually extremely important, especially given that we've got these long run skills issues to do with, I mean, really the non-graduate potential workforce, and the massive declines in training we've had, especially again in these post-industrial areas where people have lost jobs and have not received training to have the kind of requisite skills that you might think to be able to reskill to get back into work as well. So that's one thing. The other thing I think I'd like to pick up on that the other speakers mentioned as well was the fact that now this isn't just a short-term tick up now in inactivity. The durations of people in these inactivity spells, especially for people who've got ill health, are actually increasing. And of course, the state dependence associated with that makes it very difficult for people to get back into work having been out. We know we know, but it was a long run cost. The best way to get people back into work is if they have a short unemployment spell, or perhaps even a short inactivity spell, and that, before the skill loss and skill depreciation fully sets in. And so I think we're actually getting to a point now, and I think, I haven't seen any data on this, but I would be very surprised if those increased durations do not vary spatially as well, and they must do, I think. And so you're kind of getting a big concentration of people on quite long inactivity durations in some places and not in others, which seems really, really important, irrespective actually of what's going on with the demand and supply side of the jobs aspect. And so policy needs to be thinking carefully about how we can try and get rid of that state dependence and get people back at least integrated in some way. I think the systems point that Nick made is very important there.
Yeah.
The multiple systems.
We'll definitely.
And I would add into the group of organisations, that you've got, that we had in the kind of briefing about central government, combined local authorities, businesses, training providers need to be in there as well, education institutions as well, I think. Yeah. Agreed.
Alice, come back in. You talked about insecurity and the nature of it. I suppose when you're looking at looking at whether people are in the labour market or not, availability of work on the one hand, and then the nature of the the nature of the work that is or isn't available. Is that did you pick that up as being quite a significant issue and factor in terms of then thinking about whether people are more or less likely to be inactive?
Yeah, we think that's really key. So we think broadly there are kind of two big ambitions here. One is creating more good jobs, and the other is improving the quality of existing jobs. And they both they kind of overlap, but there are slightly different needs for both. So in terms of creating more good jobs, what we found is really, really crucial is that the job that you get into, whether you're coming out of a period of unemployment or a period of inactivity, the job you get into really matters for your ability to sustain that job over the long term. So if you enter an insecure job, you are more likely to remain in insecurity, as I said, for a long period, but you're also more likely to leave work again. So our study found that insecure workers are 1.4 times more likely than those with secure jobs to experience involuntary worklessness. And that's our kind of category for which we cover unemployment and economic inactivity together, or economic inactivity due to ill health together.
And just to jump in second on that, Alice, because Steve, there was a period of time in Britain and elsewhere where work first was definitely the approach, right? Which was just any job. If you're not in work, any work is better than no work, and then we can think about how we make progression. But increasingly, that doesn't seem to be the case. Is that right?
Yeah, I would also throw in the issue about the rise of the precarious position of many solo self-employed people into that. And of course, we know that varies spatially as well. And I think there's quite a significant fraction of them who can't get into regular employment in the labour force.
And that's
sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
That before.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, actually, I think that is interesting. And what we've found is that the sort of the resilience of self-employment is quite low. And during the pandemic, and particularly among men who were in self-employment, there was a significant contraction there. So we think that was a moment that really sort of increased this uptick in activity among the male population in particular. Interestingly, female self-employment was slightly more resilient during the pandemic, although it did slightly decrease as well. So we think kind of what job you get into does really matter, and there's good evidence now to demonstrate that. And we think there's a kind of role there for thinking about the state potentially as a kind of direct employer, creating more of those inclusive, secure jobs as a kind of key pathway back into work for people, or it could be kind of exploring the kickstart schemes again, that kind of space. But again, maybe we'll get more into solutions in a minute. But then just in relation to improving the quality of existing jobs, I totally agree with what Nick was talking about there in terms of the aim being about retention and about keeping people in jobs when they're in them, in good quality jobs ideally, because once they've left, it's much harder for them to come back into work. And so we're doing quite a lot of work around what does that actually look like from the employer's perspective, what what increased legislation or changed legislation might we need from government to, you know, show employers the right path, and how much of this can be done on a kind of voluntary basis. So we've got views on statutory sick pay, the type of models that are being introduced, the rate at which it's paid, also the role of occupational health and the kind of integration with that in a kind of wider system of health support, both within and outside of work. And then we think that job design itself is really key. So looking at flexibility and kind of breaking it down and thinking about actually what elements of flexible work are needed to keep people in work whilst experiencing, you know, maybe a fluctuating health condition. And we think there are really, you know, positive suggestions and sort of evidence out there that show that we can actually change the nature of work to keep people in employment for longer.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll hear from Nick on the availability, but then we'll turn to what we might do about that. And Alice, I mean, it'd be good to get your thought on whether the content of the proposed employment bill, you know, addresses some of those things, and does it address them in a material way, or is it just tinkering at the edges of some of this? But Nick, you just sort of round us off on the nature of the problem. I mean, you know, in some respects, you know, Greater Manchester is doing very well, more jobs, etc. But then, as you said, inactivity also increasing. I mean, how does the availability of work and the nature of that work, how do you think that plays into people's perceptions about whether there is work out there, if it's good work, and how then do they make decisions based on that?
I think can be a real mismatch in this space, you know, because yes, we have in Greater Manchester, we do have a lot of growth of business. We do have a lot of inward investment into the city region. But I think what we see is people that perhaps are economically inactive or unemployed or out of work don't see those as the jobs for them. And I think there's sort of several things. There's an aspiration piece in there, but there is also sort of skills gaps as well. And I think as a system, we have a responsibility to make sure that skills provision matches the business needs, but also that pipeline of people get the right support to be able to look at those as the real jobs. And I think that's where the in-work and the progression in work comes as well, because supporting people to progress in work actually frees up perhaps entry-level roles, which create opportunities and front doors for people with employers. So you get that kind of flow. But I think it's really challenging, and I think, you know, it is, you know, we're talking about what job does matter, and it's what individual does matter as well, and it's the right person for the job, but it's putting all those enabling factors in place to support an individual to be in a position to apply and know what jobs are out there, and not see them, you know, for example, in city centre Manchester, you know, we've got 3 significant universities within a couple of miles of each other, and people see the tower blocks going up and they think those tower blocks, those office blocks, are for the people coming out of those universities, and don't necessarily understand. And that's where I suppose our job and our role comes in, understand what the jobs actually are in those spaces and what's available.
Yeah, no, agreed. I agree. Yeah, it's a sort of reminder that, you know, growth and job creation is going to be necessary, because it's hard to do employment improvements if you don't have jobs. But it's never, you know, it's not you know, it's not the be all and end all. You have to work harder than that to make the connections as well, definitely.
And I think that's where the inclusive growth or the growth and reform agendas have to sit side by side to get that moving forward. Yeah,
and we'll come back to you on that and get you to say a little bit more on that. Let's turn to, you know, I suppose let's turn to a little bit to what we might do if economic activity is a problem, which it obviously is, what we might do about it. Again, let's just, so, you know, in some respects, new government, you know, we've got these 5 missions on the one hand, and I know, Steve, you've written about, you know, some issues about separating out the economic growth mission, for example, from the economic opportunity or inclusion mission, and actually, you know, you sort of raise questions about about that. We've got the employment bill, which we've already talked about. We've just got an industrial strategy green paper, which crudely we can think about it as sort of job generation type thoughts. And then we've obviously got a devolution white paper imminent, which is also about how we might knit some of these services together at the Greater Manchester scale or at the Liverpool City region scale, et cetera, and make these things a bit more integrated and joined up. So we've got different components all operating in different ways. I suppose, big question, maybe Steve, you kick us off, maybe say something a little bit about what you were thinking. How does this all fit together? Can we see a way that it begins to fit together? Are we worried that bits of it are pointing in the wrong direction, or there's obvious tensions or things that we need to think about? Steve, just give us a big picture, and I get Alice and Nick to say something similar.
I think I just have two comments on that. So there's opportunity here to do this, and there seems to be a taste to try and do this as well, which is good across government. And there seems to be, I think, from what I've seen so far, but it's a bit early days yet, there seems to be more scope for coordination and discussion across different government departments to do this. Although, of course, some of the issues are, I mean, if it's the labour market, I mean, we know that there's various things going on with DWP, and there's various things going on that the worker rights stuff is actually not in DWP, it's in DBT, the new DBT.
Yeah.
And so there is that kind of issue. So there's got to be kind of some commonality going on there. I would throw one more thing in actually about on the inactivity issue again, which is about the welfare system more generally.
Yeah.
And I do think there's scope to reform the welfare system. And we've had many, many years of a rather punitive kind of sanctions type benefit system, which is not good for people's confidence about getting into work and stuff as well. And I think we do have a serious opportunity here to turn that around and not have change the balance between the carrot and the stick here. I mean, we've had a lot, and we've had a good 10 years, maybe 15 years of sanctions really dominating that. And that's part of the reason why people have slipped onto inactivity, because of not being able to demonstrate that they're willing to search for work as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important. I think there's a real opportunity here to try and get around the inactivity problems through policy in that way as well. I mean, the advisors in job centres, definitely, I don't think they want to be punitive in any sense whatsoever. I mean, I think they would be much more welcome to having a much more cooperative and encouraging means of trying to face up to the significant problems that some people do have, and the barriers for them to be able to get into work, especially with the ill health issues persisting right now. So that's why I would put that in there as well. I would put the reform of the welfare system in there as something that could be.
And the evidence on that, Steve, you're much more familiar with than I am, but in a sense, my reading of it at least is that a heavily sanction-driven system doesn't actually produce the results that people anticipate the sanctions would. Is that a fair?
Well, it dates back a long time.
Yes.
When the real big shifts on that were done. And the real big shifts on that were done at one point when unemployment was quite high and to try and get the unemployment numbers down. And we were speak very frankly about it. That was what was going on there. And that's why we saw a huge rise in people on sickness benefits. Not just here, the US did it really massively as well, about people being on sickness benefits and therefore not being classified as unemployed. But I think the balance more recently on that has been to have a much more sanctions-based system, which it doesn't seem like offer the right incentives for people to be that economic incentives or indeed social incentives about cooperating with the system and so on as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great, Alice. Come in on this, not exclusively, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts. We were talking about job quality, job insecurity, the terms and conditions almost of being in employment, and it is a factor determining whether people are are looking for work or can get work or want to stay in work. And obviously the employment bill is part of the answer to that, or in partly a response to that. Just your sort of headline thoughts on is it moving in the right direction? Can we see substantive progress? what are the big sort of bits that you're a bit more worried about?
Sure. Yeah. So just to say, this is a big or a series of reforms that are about to happen that's really significant, because we've had a kind of policy vacuum on employment rights for a number of years now. So this does seem like a step change. It does feel like a step change. That doesn't mean it's particularly kind of radical or particularly progressive. I see it as really just fixing problems that have occurred over the last decade, really, that needed to be fixed. So a big one of that is around, security, job security. So the pieces there that the government are proposing are to provide people with the right to predictable hours. So this is their kind of way of banning 0 hours contracts, which is a difficult thing to do, given that 0 hours contracts don't sort of exist in any sort of legal form anyway. So what the government is proposing to do is give people the right to a contract that reflects their actual hours worked on a kind of rolling basis. We support that, but we do worry that, employers can still create 0 hours contract jobs and can still sort of advertise those jobs. We don't think they're going to be particularly popular among job seekers who want to get into kind of more sustainable work for the reasons that we've discussed. And we're also concerned that at the moment there may be sort of exceptions in some cases. So recruitment agencies may be able to use 0 hours contracts for kind of longer periods. The devil will be in the detail with that, but I think there's sort of areas to watch out for, but it's generally moving in the right direction. One of the other big changes is around flexibility. So the proposal from the government was that there was going to be a sort of default to flexible work for all workers in the economy. That hasn't materialised in the bill. Really, what's being proposed is not very different to what the kind of day one right workers have now, which is a right to request flexible working, and employers then have the right to turn that down if it doesn't, if it isn't sort of reasonable or isn't in line with their kind of business interests. So we do think this could be a bit of a missed opportunity, because our research shows that for particular worker groups, so some of those that are furthest from the labour market, people with disabilities, people with long-term ill health, also women workers, we find that flexible work, particularly remote and hybrid work, is a really brilliant way to get people back into jobs. And we know that there are many more jobs in the economy that could have some sort of flexibility brought in. Yeah. We know that not every job can be done from home every day of the week, but there's loads of great research out there from Timewise and other organisations about how hard to flex jobs and hard to flex sectors can introduce more flexibility. And we see there's a big discrepancy in the kind of demand for remote and hybrid working versus the jobs available. We're going to put out a report on that soon with colleagues at Lancaster University. And then I think probably the last bit maybe to mention is just the ambition to improve pay and progression in key sectors. So the social care workforce has been identified by the government as a key workforce that needs better pay, and I think probably most people would agree with that. I think that could have really important benefits to the kind of localities and places that we've been talked about, because social care jobs are foundational, they're grounded in communities. So if we improve the terms and conditions of those types of jobs, there should be kind of wider economic benefits there as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Nick, just come to you. We've had quite a few questions in the chat address about the role of a CA, but obviously in this instance GMCA. As you've said, working well is a well-established, long-running project trying to bring some of these different services together at the city region scale. You've also got in the employment charter, which is trying to help employers be better employers, be more flexible employers, and all the rest of it. And obviously, as Andy, the mayor has made a play for getting his hands on some of the employment support programs that are currently run out of JCP, out of Job Centre Plus. So you can't summarize all of that sort of stuff, but just big lessons learned, big experiences. What does that tell us about the role of the combined authority and the city region, I suppose, in trying to tackle some of these problems?
Oh, just a few little questions.
Yeah, no, I apologise. They're too big a question, but then I think you can wander freely over that and ignore the bits that you don't.
I will and try not to ramble in the process. Yeah, I think what we have been able to demonstrate is that by delivering employment support in a place with the local knowledge and the local partnerships and knowledge of the local supply chains and the sort of operators, I suppose, on the ground, we are able to get strong, if not stronger, results than things that are delivered on a national footprint. I think what's become particularly apparent is that as there's been a shift in terms of government resource, DWP resource, going towards the economically inactive in their definition and away from perhaps the people with conditionality or people that are referred onto programs from job centres, there is an even more of a need to be for the outreach and engagement work, whether that's within primary care systems or whether that's through locality level, place-based outreach work through our community organisations. And I believe really firmly and really strongly that if we want to reach and support this body, this non-amorphous mass of economically inactive people, we need to reach them through the places and the communities and the connections they have. And I think that can only be done by organisations and people. And I'm not talking CA level, I'm talking micro community level here, that can reach them. And I think sort of that is one role of the CA. It's an enabling role. Yeah. So we talk about working well, people are aware of it, but our role in the CA is much more than commissioning and monitoring government programs in effect or developing our own. We have a policy setting agenda, we have a partnership and convening agenda, and we do an awful lot of work around the evidence base. I often describe us as the glue that brings the partners together, provides that bridge between national, local and hyperlocal government to join the system up. And in some ways, and I know our mayor is not making a pitch for some of employment support at the moment. It's the full Monty of it. It's actually about everybody having their role in the system and understanding that, and it being delivered at the right level. I think. And it's also that differentiation between the benefit system and employment support. I completely agree with that kind of carrot and stick approach, and being able to disaggregate that would just remove the disincentives, which I know is a double negative, but I think it is about removing the disincentive for people to seek support, that some of the conditionality around benefits and the risk and the fear that people have have in that system.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Steve, come back in on next. I guess I'm interested in your views about the relevant role and relationship between the national and the and the local. How much what should be done at the local? How much should we go further on this? Is the sort of the kind of model that Nick is outlining that's now happening and have been happening for a while and emerging in GM, is that a model for for everywhere? I mean, how do you think about that?
I think the spatial disparities mean that some degree has to be, some of it has to be targeted at where the problems are. But that doesn't mean there's not a role for a national policy to redefine. I think all three of us have actually said stuff about the conditionality and the sanctions operating in the benefit welfare system. And so, that's much more the remit of national policy, but of course there can be local aspects to that as well. So I think both have to operate in these settings, and then going then to the labour market side of things, the same is true there, because there's severe supply problems in some places, there's severe demand problems in other places. Some have both, and some don't have much of either, where people can actually get employed reasonably well if especially especially when we've had the more recent experience of a relatively tight labour market, although I don't think it was as tight as many people have tried to argue. Actually, I think there's still quite a lot of slack. I mean, that point about the solo self-employed and people taking those jobs, even though that's not necessarily where they want to go, and the fact that that hasn't ticked back up. I mean, Alice is dead right. The self-employed, especially those own account workers without employees, took an absolute hammering in the pandemic and haven't recovered back since again. And I think, I mean, we don't have much evidence on this. It'd be much better. I would like to see some more evidence. I mean, the part of the problem we have is with the labour force survey issues. Looking at the transitions, that'd be very interesting transitions from solo self-employment troubles in the pandemic into inactivity, and look at the durations of people. But the trouble is, we can't do quite as good a job as maybe we'd like to on the research. But I suspect that's a factor in play. And I suspect that's a factor in play that's very different in different parts of the country as well.
Yeah. Alice, come in on this in terms of, the relationship between the, local and the national, how you see that evolving.
Yeah.
Have we got the balance right? What would, if we wanted, CAs to do more, what might we need to, to do to make that kind of happen?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said then, that there's a need for kind of national level agenda setting and the baseline of rights that everyone can kind of expect. And I think that takes out some of the sort of problematic competition maybe between employers as well, where the employers who want to do well are sometimes being penalised, or that, they want to do the right thing, but they're being penalised by, more unscrupulous employers who are just, going off the bottom line and will employ whatever methods necessary to, to save money. And so I think having very clear direction from national policy on employment rights, on kind of what's expected, is important. But I think at that local level, it is really critical. And I think, just to add to what Nick was saying, I think providing some of that wraparound support for employers themselves, particularly when we're talking about groups of workers who have maybe been experiencing health conditions or have disabilities. The surveys of employees that we've done has shown there is, a significant amount of, nervousness and lack of confidence from their side in how to actually approach employing groups that they might have concerns about, whether their work environment is adequate, etc. And so I think having more support to make that journey, more appealing for more employers, I think would be really good as well.
Yeah. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I suppose we've talked a little bit about aspects of the, where the new government is on some of these issues. I mean, Nick, you start us off, as you said, maybe I was being slightly cautious in saying that your mayor wanted some of it, and you're telling me that he wants all of it. So that's fair enough. But I mean, in terms of the sort of things that we've been discussing, your experiences, where are you confident that the government, is on side, understands the agenda, wants to really make progress? Where are you a little bit more worried that maybe, or that, there's a less of a willingness to do? I mean, how would you summarize where you think we are? And I get Stephen, obviously Alice, to say something similar. But Nick, just given your aspirations and ambitions and track record, how confident you are that this government gets it?
I'll caveat everything with, this is my view, not my mayor's.
Of course, no. The disclaimer is flashing as we.
I think we are in a much better position than we have ever been, and a much stronger understanding with the current government, not only of the benefits of devolution. And when I talk about devolution, I don't just mean about funding.
Yeah.
I mean about accountability.
Yeah.
And accountability for those outcomes. And I think that's really important. It's not just about a flow of funding from national to local. It's about ownership and accountability of what we are doing.
Yeah.
And the funding actually follows that rather than leads and drives it. So I think we are, I think there is a understanding of the theory around that, and a recognition that things can be delivered in place as, if not more effectively. I think there is a shift in the current government in terms of the relationship as being seen as partners in place, rather than perhaps a funder commissioner type role, which might be a way of describing how some of our devolution in this space has looked and felt previously. It's more than that, but I think it's not far off in some instances. And I think the thing that we are finding really, really helpful, because it builds on where we've been, is the joined up narrative around skills and employment and health, and that happening at a cross government level. And because that's, you know, we're very lucky that we have the same footprint, the same geographies around JCP, around our ICP, and around our combined authority. That's unbelievably helpful. But actually, that recognition and acknowledgement that you need all of those things and other public services in the mix, but to make a difference to people's life and look at the whole picture, rather than taking a siloed approach, a departmentally siloed approach to different activity. And, you know, careers is another classic example. You know, it sits across DFE, DWP, and we need to join that up into a smooth, you know, and so, and I think so some of the really positive things is that joining up the Jobs and Careers Service, bringing things together. So I think it's really early days. I think conceptually, and the narrative is right. I think, as with all these things, the devil will be
proof will be in the pudding. The devil is in the detail. No, I'm with you. You know, and we can only we have to wait and see in some respects, but I agree with that. Alice, come in on this in the sense that, you know, things that you're encouraged about already, and things, I suppose, you know, you would raise as a potential issue that might still need further addressing.
Yeah, so I suppose I would just finish my bit by saying that I think a lot of the issues we've been talking about today, you know, are huge. These are long-term issues to fix. So I think we do need to be realistic about how much is going to be necessarily achieved in, you know, in the next few years, for example. So to give detail of what I'm thinking about there, I mean, reversing some of the negative impacts or the community impacts of deindustrialization, huge thing. Improving population health, huge thing. So we're really focused, and we're really encouraged to see that the government is giving attention to something that we think sits at the kind of foundation of both of those things, which is work quality. So we think, you know, commitment to that is really important, and we are encouraged by that. We think having kind of healthy work as an ambition, so good work, yes, but, you know, good healthy work as an ambition, guiding the legislative changes here, whether that's around the kind of reform of the welfare system or of the labour market sort of employment rights side of it. We think that's you know, encouraging to see that that's being talked about by the government, and there is change happening. I think something we'd probably caution against is thinking too much about individuals as kind of economic units who, you know, if we fix their health with a, you know, jab to deal with obesity or whatever the latest headline grabbing thing has been, then, you know, then we're going to suddenly drive up labour market participation. You know, we think that's the wrong way to come at this, and looking at the kind of the.
What, you mean the headlines are not entirely nuanced and accurate? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, not quite.
I mean, that can't be true. Can't be true. That's a good point. Steve, final thoughts from you. I mean, you know, where you think we are, whether, you know, is the government, you know, going in the direction of where the, you know, where the evidence and the experience suggests, and any sort of red flags or, you know, potential issues that you still think need to be a bit more thought through?
I mean, there clearly is scope for things to be done. I mean, you know, we've suffered more economic stagnation than most of our international competitors over the last 15 years. And part of that is down to government policy being totally fragmented and not joined up in any sense whatsoever. And so I kind of do think the thing we've written about the growth and opportunity missions, I do think the word is opportunity, I suppose. But these do give an opportunity to offset the kind of economic stagnation we've had by means of generating inclusive growth, if done in a coordinated way, which is something we just haven't done before. And, you know, and even when we manage to facilitate growth, it's not been growth, you know, that lifts all boats at all. It's been, you know, and it doesn't trickle down in the way it's been done before. And I do think the current setup does hold some promise for improving upon that. It's difficult, but it does have some scope to get productivity and living standards up if it can be successful. And that's what we want. And that will be able to generate jobs that people can move into as well. If that's doable. There are serious structural issues, and there's serious structural issues in some places much more than others that make that difficult. But I think there is some hope that something can be done now. The Treasury-led growth agenda in conjunction with the other missions in the other government departments, if that's done in a kind of reasonably joined up collaborative way, that does hold some hope for at least things not being as bad as they have been.
Yeah, quite. I think that's a good round of optimism to finish. It is. I mean, those of us involved in sort of thinking about the economy and public services, we don't often finish on a round of optimism. But I leave with a sense of optimism from the three of you. So for nothing else, I thank you enormously for your contribution over the last 58 minutes, but particularly for your last round of giving me a bit of optimism. But genuinely, thank you very much to Nick, to Alison, to Stephen. Obviously, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks for your questions. Until we see each other again on a related issue, take care and stay safe. Thanks very much. Bye for now.